often people, especially when they're sort of in a place of struggling with their boundaries, what's happening is they're trying to set boundaries and it leads to conflict. Right. So it feels like this is like, it almost doesn't make sense when we say, oh, you'll have better relationships when you can set boundaries, because that's not what people are experiencing. They're like, this is just leading to fights and yelling at each other. And so it's better if I don't set boundaries, I'll just keep my mouth shut, right? Then at least there's peace. Right. But I would ask people to really think about whether that is a satisfying relationship for you, if you feel like you just need to keep your mouth shut and
if there's no space for you and your needs.
Yeah, and not set any limits with somebody. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's actually a satisfying relationship.
Hi, I'm Biz Cush, a life coach and therapist, and your host here on the Awaken Your Wise Woman podcast. We're talking to women all over the world who found their way back to themselves, to their inner knowing, to their intuition, to their wisest self. We're exploring how to feel alive, authentic, engaged, and fully present in your life. Let's awaken your wise woman. Welcome back to the Awaken Your Wise Woman podcast. I'm your host, Biz Cush, and I'm so excited that you're here with me today and appreciative of you following the podcast on whatever podcast player, if you do, or being a subscriber of my newsletter, which also gives you updates on the podcast as well. I appreciate you being a part of this journey with me, and it's always an adventure, podcasting. I feel as if between the technology and whether there's a good connection with the guest and the material, I never know. I think all the conversations are great, but you never know what might happen. During my conversation a few months ago with Kristen Neff, she had a coyote walk through, or a mountain lion, something walk through her yard, and she had to pause to marvel at this creature in her backyard that she'd never seen before. In other conversations, I've had a coughing fit where I had to pause and edit the audio because something got stuck in my throat. And in this interview today with Sharon, I could not get my microphone to connect. I couldn't figure it out. We logged in and out of Zoom multiple times. The microphone just wasn't picking up. Well, did a little problem solving after talking to her. I still couldn't get it to connect and was feeling very frustrated about that. It's a good mic. I could figure out what could be wrong. Turns out the microphone was turned off. Even though there was a little blue light saying it had power, the on-off switch had gotten knocked to off. Go figure. So the audio quality may not be the best on my end. Sharon, of course, had a lovely microphone, and I didn't. I used my earbuds from Apple and that little microphone. So hopefully it's good enough. The conversation was great. So any audio flaws, hopefully you can overlook. And my sound engineer is amazing. So Laura will fix it up so it sounds lovely. So if you'd like a chance to work with me for free, you can apply for a free coaching session. I'm taking applications through the end of February of 2022. And you can apply and maybe you'll get picked. Maybe you'll get to work with me for 90 minutes on a topic of your choice. Maybe it's a life transition. Maybe it is working on being more compassionate with yourself. Maybe it's about learning how to recognize and empower you to have healthier boundaries. Maybe it's around learning how to really tune into yourself so that you are taking the best care of you and allowing your intuition and trust in yourself to flourish and grow. I would love to work with you. I hope that you will sign up. So if you go to elizabethcushcoaching.com, you can find the link in the banner of the homepage. So on a mobile device, it says right there, apply for a free session. on the webpage. If you're using a computer or I don't know what it looks like on an iPad, but on a computer, there's a link that says apply for a free session. So if you're interested, please fill that out. Limited time only. Again, it's a 90-minute deep dive session with you on a topic that feels important to you. So Sharon and I today are talking about boundaries. And towards the end of the conversation, we discuss how boundaries really help you feel more powerful and empowered in your relationship. So I hope you'll stay tuned for the whole conversation with Sharon. We are talking about her book, but just about boundaries in our lives and when it's been hard for us and how we've moved forward to being better able to recognize our own boundaries and what matters for us. So Sharon's been on the podcast in its former version, the Woman Warriors podcast, 2 other times, which I will include those links in the show notes. But today I will give you a little background on Sharon. Sharon Martin is a licensed clinical social worker and a psychotherapist specializing in codependency recovery with an online practice serving California residents. For the past 20 years, she's been helping perfectionists and people pleasers overcome self-doubt and shame, embrace their imperfections, learn to set boundaries, and reclaim their self-worth. Sharon writes the blog Conquering Codependency for Psychology Today and is the author of the CBT workbook for perfectionism and the Better Boundaries workbook, which we're going to be talking a little bit about today. If you want to order either of those books, the links to purchase them will also be in the show notes. But let's jump into our conversation with Sharon. Hi, Sharon, and welcome to the Awaken Your Wise Woman podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's so nice I'm going to say have you back, even though you have not been a part of this version of the podcast. You've been on the Woman Warriors podcast twice.
Yes. Well, and I was thinking about that before we started, and I enjoyed our last conversation so much about speaking up about what you need. And I think it's such a great segue into talking about boundaries too.
Yes.
So yes, I'm happy to be here and sort of expand on that and go a little deeper on some of those topics.
Yes. Because they're so connected. Identifying what you need, but being able to ask for your needs and to then set a boundary around whatever those needs might be.
Mm-hmm.
So there probably are listeners who haven't listened to our other conversations, but we'll link to those in the show notes. But for those who don't know who you are, if you could share a little bit about yourself and your inspiration for helping others in the way that you do.
Well, thank you. Well, I am a psychotherapist in California, and I've been in practice for, over 20 years at this point. So I've been doing this a long time. And I really love being a therapist. That has been a great source of satisfaction for me, and really being able to work with people, mostly one-on-one in a lot of different settings. Now I'm in private practice, but I've worked in mental health in a lot of different capacities over the years. But I think one of the things that has sort of transformed over the years for me is both wanting to maybe sort of tap into some of my more creative parts and use those in some different ways. I think both in the therapy room, but outside definitely. And part of that's been writing for me and doing some other creations. But the other piece has been that I have wanted to sort of extend who I can help. When, those of us that are therapists or coaches who primarily, again, work with people on a one-to-one basis, right? We only have so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
And so that means we can only help so many people. And like, as satisfying as that is, right, there's also a sense of, wow, I'd really like to be able to share this with some more people. There's a lot of people who not only that I can't see personally, but who can't access therapy for a number of different reasons. And there are some other ways that I think that we can provide some help and some support and some resources. And so that's part of what I have, sort of been moving towards over the last few years, especially with writing, is being able to, kind of get out information, that I have, developed and come to understand and learned over the years, and being able to share that with more people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've got 2 or more books. I mean, I know the Better Boundaries workbook is coming out soon. And then you have 2 other books as well, right?
Well, I've got the CBT workbook for perfectionism.
Okay.
Yep, that's the one I wrote a couple of years ago. I do have some little ebooks on my website, but those are the 2 sort of traditionally published
physical books that we can hold on to, like as we were describing. It's so nice to have a book to actually go back to. But so I follow you on social media, and you and I have talked multiple times. So we've gotten to know each other. And in fact, I remember starting out in my private practice and feeling, hearing through multiple sources that writing and having a blog was so important. And your blog was so inspirational for me in terms of how often you wrote and how often you were putting out content, putting out work. And I remember talking to you early on saying, like, 1, how do you do it? But 2, give me some tips. And you were so gracious to help me and didn't charge me anything, which was really kind. But yes, so I feel like we've had a relationship over the years, which has been really nice. So I appreciate your willingness to be back here on the podcast to share your wisdom with our listeners. And today we are going to be talking about your new book, but also just about healthy boundaries and why they're so important and how we can get better at creating boundaries, holding our boundaries, knowing what boundaries we need.
Yes, that is the question.
Right?
Not always an easy answer.
Yeah.
Boundaries are complicated. I wish that I could just say, here's the one size fits all answer. And even in the book, I do have some very specific steps to help people learn to set better boundaries. But even within that, the truth is it's very individualized in terms of us figuring out what we need as individual people. My needs are going to be different than yours, which means the boundaries that I need to set are going to be different than somebody else's. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that the way that we kind of struggle with setting those boundaries looks different for different people. Yeah. I think there's a lot of people who simply kind of avoid boundaries.
Sure.
They feel uncomfortable. Oftentimes people have had a negative response to their trying to set boundaries. Somebody's been very angry with them or just sort of blown them off. And of course, when that happens, especially repeatedly, we can get into a mindset of like, what's the point? This doesn't even work. Yeah. And then for other people, they feel a lot of guilt when they try to ask for something or to set a limit. And again, that's another way that we kind of end up in that place of just, I don't think I want to do this. It's more trouble than it's work. I feel really bad when I do it. And then there are other people who I think almost use boundaries as a way to control or punish other people. And that's maybe sort of another end of that spectrum, but it's also not an effective way to set boundaries because that's not really the intent of boundaries. They aren't a means of trying to force other people to do what you want them to do. Even if you feel like that's coming from a place of, I need something, right? I mean, it's both a reality that we can't actually force people, but it's also not a positive relational experience. The person that I'm setting a boundary with to feel like I am making them do something, or there's a negative consequence, or there's a lot of anger that's coming with that boundary, instead of it truly being a request. I might ask somebody to change their behavior, but that's all I can do is I can ask. I can't force it. Yeah. And again, when we do that, it tends to backfire. And that's another way that people end up feeling like, well, these boundaries just don't work. It ends up in an argument and there's a lot of conflict. and wasn't the whole point of the boundary, to get my needs met and to not have conflict with people.
Yeah.
And when they do work, that is what can happen.
Yeah.
But again, they're just sort of different ways that people end up struggling with their boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one quote from your book that resonated so much for me, because I think it's kind of hard to describe exactly what boundaries are, because as you said, they're different for everybody, but so what I loved is you say a boundary is a dividing line that defines who you are as an individual and how you'll interact with others. Boundaries define what's me, my body, my feelings, my property, my responsibilities, on, and what's not me. Boundaries also communicate how we want to be treated by others, what's okay, what's not okay with us, how close we want to get physically and emotionally to others. So to me, it just feels so like, okay, this is me. This is what I need. This is you. This is what you need. And we can both have those needs and set those boundaries, but it doesn't mean there has to be, sometimes there'll be conflict, right? But we can still recognize that we have these boundaries to keep us safe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a lot in just that one piece that you mentioned there.
Yeah.
But I think most people do tend to think about the aspect of boundaries that's really limit setting. And that's an important piece of boundaries. And that's, what I was talking about earlier. That's saying no, that's, saying, hey, could you give me some time to myself? Those are limits essentially. But there's this other related piece, which is the way that boundaries help us maintain our sense of self, right? That I am me component of it, mm-hmm. which is also very important. But I think it's harder to maybe see that in action because it's not a clear statement that you're necessarily making.
Yeah.
But it is this, sort of healthy amount of separation. And I think of it like in relationships, we want to be close to the people that we care about, but we can't be so close that we essentially become one person or one unit. We want to still have our sense of independence and individuality. At least these are certainly Western ideas about relationships. I shouldn't speak about every relationship in every culture.
Right.
But this is the way that we tend to think about healthy relationships, is that there is this connection and ability to come together and feel emotional connection and physical connection with other people. But like I said, we're not sort of swallowed up in that. So it's not that I have to agree with everything or I need to take on all of your feelings and problems and feel like they're mine, or, that I can have my own values and goals and I can kind of do my own thing and be my own person. And that's okay, that we can still feel close without being enmeshed, that overly close state where there isn't that differentiation between who's who and who's responsible for what. And that's the other piece of this sort of identity piece, is when it's clear that we're two separate people, then it's also clear who's responsible for what.
Yeah.
Even if this is as simple as something like household chores.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise we kind of get into this state of, well, I don't know, whose job that is. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's never been really clearly defined, or I don't know who's responsible for making the kid's dentist appointment, right? Because it's like it's all lumped in together. And then we end up in a place of sometimes blaming or just feeling responsible for things that really aren't our responsibility, our job, things that, that we could control.
Yeah. Yeah. Or feeling resentment, feeling like this is all, it's all on us and, nobody else is helping. And that there's the sense that I'm doing it all and nobody's.
Yeah. That's a big clue that you need some better boundaries, is when you're in that place of feeling resentful and overwhelmed and it's all too much. Either that's because you have sort of volunteered yourself for too much. Or the other, default is that you've accepted, you've sort of taken on the responsibility without there ever even being a conversation about whose job it is.
Yeah.
It's just that's default is, you think you have to do it all.
Yeah.
And again, there's a variety of reasons why we end up feeling that way.
Absolutely.
But definitely if people are listening and feeling this sense of, oh my gosh, I have like so much on my to-do list, or even just in your head. I think a lot of women just have a constant list in their head of the things that they are responsible for that aren't even necessarily actionable items. They're more, I'm sort of generally worried about, the well-being of other people, or that this needs to get taken care of. And that's a big emotional load to carry.
Oh my gosh.
For sure.
Definitely. Well, and so much, I think, for women, at least a lot of the clients I work with, but too for myself, knowing that there are a lot of things that I worry about and sort of hold on to as my responsibility, air quotes, that I don't have any control over, that I really can't do much about other than worry. And that mental load, I think what's helped me some through reading some of your stuff, but just recognizing, what are the things that I can do or what I have control over, whether it's my own behavior, doing things differently, letting things go. That's made a huge difference for me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of different ways that you can think about that in terms of boundaries. One, again, is do you need to ask somebody else for help? But there's also an element of sort of setting this limit with yourself around the worry.
Yes.
And sometimes this is, a technique that we use with worry is really, prescribing for people to limit how much time they spend worrying about something.
Right.
It's not easy to do. I don't mean to suggest that simply saying, I'm only going to think about this for 10 minutes is what's going to happen, even if that's your intention. But it is an attempt at, putting a boundary around that. There's sort of a limit. I'm going to try to corral that so that it doesn't permeate everything that I'm doing and I'm thinking about it all day long, but maybe there's a designated time for me to do that.
Right, right. I'm curious if you're willing to share some of your own experience of whether it's in writing or with your practice, like, are there places where boundaries have been, or in family life, in your relationships, where boundaries have been harder for you to, like, I find it harder to hold boundaries with family personally, but yeah, I don't know about you.
Oh yeah, sure. And I don't remember if I've mentioned this before here or not, but certainly I grew up very much, what I describe as a people pleaser, of feeling like it was not okay to say no, that was going to disappoint people. I think that was the biggest thing for me. It wasn't necessarily that people were going to be overtly angry, but I didn't want to disappoint people. There was a big sense of needing to do the right thing and follow the rules and sort of be a good girl. That kind of element that really informed a lot of the decisions that I was making, which then, as you can imagine, leads to a place of not feeling comfortable saying no, right? And then taking on, too many things, or I think for me, it was often things that I didn't really want to be doing. Maybe it wasn't necessarily too many things, but it was just using my time and energy for things that weren't, either that interesting to me or didn't really align with my goals or what was most important to me at that time. And that ends up feeling unfulfilling mostly. And again, there's some element of resentment there. Yeah. And then I definitely recognize, looking back when my kids were little, that I did not do a good job of asking for help, especially from my husband. I think it's probably, the biggest place that showed up. Mm-hmm. And again, carrying a lot of that resentment because he wasn't, helping out as much as I needed him to, but I wasn't asking.
Yeah.
there was again a sense of both that I should be doing it all, like that was somehow my job. And then, and I'm not proud about this aspect of it either, but there was an element of that my way was the right way. And that's a way that I have gotten in my own way about setting boundaries and asking for help, is being too rigid about what the help was going to look like. And this is sort of where I, crosses over to my, perfectionist tendencies. Perfectionism, it is perfectionism, but it's maybe not sort of in the classic sense that people think about it. Because I don't know that it was really thinking this is perfect. It was more that this was the way I wanted it to be done. And so there was that controlling element of, my way is the right way. And if you're not going to do it my way, then don't bother. Right. And then I'm in this place of being resentful a lot of the time and overtired. And that sense of overwhelm again comes in.
Yeah.
So I definitely can see places where I needed to both be making those requests, saying, I need this, and setting limits and saying, I'm not available to do that. That's not something I'm interested in. That's not something that really fits with my schedule or whatever at this point in time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and for me, I learned through, watching my parents that the way to ask for what you needed was more through sort of passive aggressive suggestions or comments. And I can remember very recently having a conversation with my husband about, I think it was about what we were going to have for lunch. And I made some comment about, not eating chips because they're not healthy or something. And my husband was like, was that a passive aggressive way of telling me that I shouldn't? And it maybe, I don't clearly remember what it was, but just his question of, are you directing that at me or are you really just talking to yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
I am still working on how to be more direct and clear about what my needs are in a kind, compassionate way versus an unclear and passive aggressive way, which is just doesn't leave, I don't feel good about it. And he doesn't feel good about it. Or, even my children, same thing. Right.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I think a lot of us do more of that than we even realize.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe we think we're making a suggestion or even being helpful at times, with some of those things. But yes, there's sort of some anger underneath it.
Yeah. Yeah. Some sense of wanting to control their behavior in some way without actually saying it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, right. And again, sort of this, when we bring that back to the boundary conversation, it's like, stay in your own lane is the way I think about that, is focus on what you need and what you can control. And your husband's his own person. He wants to eat chips, let him eat chips, right? I mean, it's both like probably not an issue worth trying to get him to change about. And again, I think it's, and what right do you have, really?
Right. It's his body, right?
Adult. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's again, sort of respecting, that he can make his own decisions, which I think kind of gets into another aspect of boundaries that is hard is when somebody that you care about is doing something that you disagree with or you think is harmful. And I'm not really talking on the scope of eating chips, but sometimes it's really much more significant.
Oh, sure. Risky behavior. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Right. Somebody's drinking too much or they're driving recklessly or, something like that. And you feel real concern about them. Mm-hmm. And this gets to be a real sticky place with boundaries and figuring out where is your place in talking to that person about that, making suggestions, making requests for them to change. And at what point do we need to accept that they are entitled to make their own decisions, even if we disagree?
Yeah. And that is so, so hard, I think. I mean, especially as you said, people that we really care about, that we don't want them to, we want them to stay safe, or we want them to be making what we consider the right decisions.
Mm-hmm.
It is hard. I find that especially in working with parents with teenagers, where the parents may be, whether it's what they're choosing to wear to school. And I can remember this from my own kids, raising them too, sort of having a conversation with myself about like, what battle do I really want to, what's really important, right? Well, no drinking and driving, right? That wasn't like, there was no, and if they did it, then there were consequences. There were boundaries that were then set for them if they couldn't. But, if my son decided he wanted to dye his hair green, I was like, all right, if that's what feels right for you in this moment, that's a boundary that maybe I would have tried to hold up at one point, but was willing to say it's not ultimately worth the argument.
Yeah, and you're talking about a couple of different really important parts. One is the way that our boundaries need to shift with our children as they get older. Mm-hmm. Not, maybe that is something that when they were small, the boundary would have looked different. Sure. You don't let, 5-year-olds do the same thing as 15-year-olds.
Absolutely.
And there's this, again, what we would generally say is a healthy thing for you to let your teenager start to express who he is, right? That's cultivating that boundary for him to have his own identity and it not to, he doesn't have to do everything you agree with or have the same values or want to do the same things, right? This is both a natural and healthy thing for kids to be able to separate, again, both emotionally and physically eventually from their parents.
Right.
We don't really want our kids to be our clones.
Yeah. They need to developmentally, feel safe and secure or whatever, clear in their boundaries around who they are.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And for your child is to say, this is what I want to do. This is who I am, that we need to work on trying to respect that that's their boundary. That's who they are. And at a certain point, we no longer have the right to force them to be somebody else.
Yeah.
And again, like this is, if we don't, I think ultimately then we risk losing the relationship or at least damaging it if we cannot respect other people's boundaries. And this goes for all people, not just our children, certainly, but, if we get into a place where we are insisting, again, sort of at that extreme of being controlling and thinking that my needs are more important than somebody else's, my way of doing things. That does not hold up. People aren't going to want to have a relationship with you if it's
my way or the highway. Yeah.
Or it's sort of contingent on them being
a certain way.
Yeah, something that they're not, somebody that they're not, or doing things that don't work for them.
Yeah. Well, I know that, yes, parenting, I think brings up a lot for a lot of people in terms of boundaries, setting boundaries, but also what boundaries were either enforced or forced or not enforced at all on us growing up. It impacts us as adults too, for sure. Mm-hmm. And I know we've had some of those conversations too. I'm curious to talk to you more, sort of a little more in detail, because I read your book. I was fortunate enough to get the galley copy of it and would love to have you talk a little bit about what your hopes were for the book and maybe even if there were certain things you'd like to share from the book that might be helpful for maybe people starting out on this journey of boundary setting.
Well, I think one thing is definitely that people who are struggling with boundaries, they're not alone. That this is, it's common. A lot of people have difficulty with boundaries. So I hope that it is, maybe a little bit of, destigmatizing around that and people don't feel such a sense of like that there's something personally wrong with them if this is something that's difficult for them. And part of that, I really talk about boundaries as a skill that people can learn. And often it is because nobody taught you how to do it. And that is obviously not your fault. If you grew up in a family that did not have healthy boundaries, there's a good chance you didn't learn how to set them.
Yeah.
Because we learn so much of this through observation. It's very rare that parents are going to have a conversation with their children using the word boundaries. Now, there's probably conversations about rules or limits, which is an element of it, but it tends to be a pretty one-sided conversation, right? And, there's another side of it, which is for the child to also have the right to have boundaries. And often that doesn't happen. Yeah. But anyway, so that's one piece of it, which is I hope that people will come away from the book not feeling like there's something wrong with them or they have done something wrong that has caused this struggle for them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, of course, is that I really hope that people gain some of those practical skills that they need, because that's what we're really looking for is, to have
some
the
shift.
Behavior change, right? To actually know how to do it and to feel confident. And that's why I like writing workbooks, because they're action oriented. They're actual steps and exercises for people to do that I think is important beyond just reading about something and understanding why you're doing it, or again, feeling some sense of, okay, I'm not alone in this. But then there's, of course, what everybody's really looking for is, well, what the heck do I do? How do I solve this problem?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where you walk through, some of the very specific steps. In the book, there are a lot of communication skills and tips for people to really think about how they are delivering their boundaries so that they are most likely to be heard, understood, accepted, well received, right? That's definitely a component, is we need to think about how we're setting the boundaries. And then there's what boundaries do I set?
Yes.
And the other thing that I talk a lot about in the book is making the distinction between when do we need to ask somebody else for something as part of our boundaries. Again, if that's I need to ask for help, or I need to ask somebody to stop doing something that's hurtful to me or uncomfortable for me. And what are the places where I'm the one who needs to make the change? And again, this gets back to what we talked about at the beginning, is recognizing that we can't always get other people to make the changes, even if they're very reasonable changes in our opinion, things that feel important to us. There are going to be situations where you are dealing with somebody who is not interested in changing their behavior. They aren't going to compromise.
Yeah.
They don't understand your point of view, even if you use all those great communication skills. And then you need to figure out, well, what is it that I can do? Because this is the other thing that is, I really hope people come away feeling like they're not helpless in these situations.
Right. I was thinking of the word empowerment, right? To give ourselves the power to.
Right, because when we set up our boundaries so that we need somebody else to change in order for us to feel safe or to be satisfied or, get our needs met, we have now, sort of given all of that power to somebody else to decide whether I can be okay. Right. And if it's a relational situation where that's going to happen, that may be okay. But like I said, there are going to be situations where it's not going to be possible. And I don't want people to think then I'm backed into a corner and I'm just going to have to deal with this bullying behavior or this uncomfortable situation or this overloaded schedule.
Yes.
So, I talk a lot about, trying to see where you have choices and where you have power. And that doesn't mean you're going to like all of the choices, but it's important to realize that you have choices.
Yes.
Because as things shift, some of those choices may become options you want to exercise, even if they're not the ideal solution to the situation.
Yeah.
But I still, like I said, I think there's a lot of good that can come from trying to frame your boundaries as, what changes can I make to get my needs met? in this situation, because that's where you're most likely to have success.
Yeah. And speaking from personal experience, that can kind of be scary too, because maybe, and this isn't all the time, but sometimes the choices might be, for instance, you suggested bullying or relationships where you feel your needs are never being met. Maybe that might mean the choice is to step away from that relationship or limit involvement. And that can be scary and hard. And especially if it's family or somebody we feel close to. But also, I think what's been hard for me and what I've worked with other clients too is that your needs do matter though. Like it's not okay to keep getting hurt or being disappointed or abused, outrightly abused. Like that you deserve to take care of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's another really important piece of it that is, it's a struggle for folks who really don't feel like their needs matter. And again, I mean, usually we can trace this back to the way that we grew up in situations where that was the experience that we had, is that nobody was interested in our needs or they were dismissed.
Yeah. Or we were shamed for
ignored. Yep, yes. Shamed. That's another one for sure.
Yeah.
Right. Then we come into our adult relationships with the mindset of, I shouldn't need anything, or if I do, I'm not going to ask for it because what's the point? Nobody cares.
Yeah. Or I'll be disappointed, right?
Yeah, I'll be disappointed. Yeah. My job is to take care of everybody else's needs. And again, I think that's a big one for women in particular, is feeling like we should sacrifice our own needs because your kids' needs, your spouse's needs, everybody else's needs, your parents' needs is more important. And then it becomes, maybe if there's anything left over for me, I'll do something for me. But let's be honest, there's really not much left over.
Yeah. When we're giving. Yeah.
And the only way that's going to change is if we make a concerted effort to recognize that we are important. We do have value, and not just in what we can do for other people or whether we're sort of quote unquote productive or not, but just because we are human beings and everybody has worth and everybody deserves to be safe and to be their own person and not feel, smothered, pressured, and hurt by other people.
Yeah.
And it seems like such a fundamental thing that everybody should know that, but it's not, right? And that's tough. And, there are some exercises in that book as well that talk about trying to understand and develop a sense of self-worth and an understanding that needs are universal. They're not specific to you or sort of a failing, that if you need rest, it's because you've done something wrong. This is just the human experience, is that we need things like rest. We need things like connection to other people. We need fun, all kinds of things that are true for everybody. And so there's nothing wrong with having those needs.
Yeah. I mean, there's a meme that floats around on social media every once in a while that's like, just because you have needs doesn't mean you're needy, because we've come to see that word needy as this very negative. That's how I feel, like that. Yeah. Needy has this negative connotation, yet everybody has needs, right? We all have needs, and having needs isn't a bad thing.
Right. And I think you're right. I mean, that's sort of a message that we've gotten, that there's something wrong with needing something from other people.
Yeah.
But on the other side, I mean, you can think about just how lonely and isolating life would be if we didn't need anything, right? I mean, if you could truly be completely independent, I don't think that'd be a satisfying life either. Because why would you be in connection with other people? The connection is the give and take.
Absolutely. I'm curious, I know we've talked about feeling more empowered in your life and the benefits of learning how to set boundaries and maintaining them can bring some positive aspects to your life. Besides feeling more empowered, are there other things that you would highlight that open up for people when they do begin setting boundaries in a more consistent way?
I think it really hits so many different pieces or areas of our life. One is definitely the relationships that we have and the potential for us to have more satisfying and, I guess what we would sort of call healthier relationships, more, mutually respectful relationships where there is that give and take. Often people, especially when they're sort of in a place of struggling with their boundaries, what's happening is they're trying to set boundaries and it leads to conflict. Right. So it feels like this is like, it almost doesn't make sense when we say, oh, you'll have better relationships when you can set boundaries, because that's not what people are experiencing. They're like, this is just leading to fights and yelling at each other. And so it's better if I don't set boundaries, I'll just keep my mouth shut, right? Then at least there's peace. Right. But I would ask people to really think about whether that is a satisfying relationship for you, if you feel like you just need to keep your mouth shut and
if there's no space for you and your needs.
Yeah, and not set any limits with somebody. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's actually a satisfying relationship. It's sort of getting over this hump, though, of being able to know how to set the boundary in a way that, somebody else can hear that and is likely to be able to meet your needs. And the other aspect of it is you might think of boundaries as, expectations in relationships. And when we're setting boundaries, what we're doing is we're being clear about what we expect also. And I think when you frame it like that, it makes a little bit more sense. If I have clear expectations, there is less conflict. There's less disappointment. Sometimes if you think about this, maybe in like a work situation, it makes a little bit more sense to people. You think about if your boss is very clear about what your job duties are, what you're expected to do, when you're, supposed to do it, you have a chance of doing that, right? You can live up to those expectations because you know what they are, or you can work on compromise and negotiating different expectations. But when we don't know what's expected of us, it's very hard to meet those expectations. And it sort of inevitably leads to not meeting somebody's expectations. And then there's disappointment and there's arguments and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one way that, relationships can be improved. And then I think the other thing is really our overall health, physical health and emotional health, because boundaries are such a strong component of self-care, in the sense that they are how we take care of ourselves, both physically, right? As we've been talking about, sometimes it's like, I need to go to bed on time. That's sort of a boundary that I set for myself, or I need to not take on too many work projects so that I don't get overrun and maybe get sick, right? Those are ways that it impacts our physical health. Right. But then certainly our emotional health is involved in this, right? We've been talking a lot about resentment and feeling overwhelmed, depleted, and those are guilty. Those are all feelings that are distressful for us, right? Or we might feel a lot of anxiety or that hopelessness, right? So there's all these elements that if we can kind of get our boundaries in line and working better for us, we're going to experience less of those sort of negative feelings.
Yeah. More positive mental health. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the whole expectations piece is all of it feels really super important. But I think one thing that I just wanted to mention was with expectations, I can go into a conversation about my needs with expectations about what the other person is going to do, but that might not happen. I can ask for those needs to be met. And if I'm expecting, even if I'm not being clear, that they're going to know what I need, and that doesn't happen, then I get resentful. I know we talked about that, but just that there's such a connection between the resentment and the expectations that really Like if I'm not being clear about what it is I need and what my expectations are, how can anybody else meet them versus also me knowing what's expected of me?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
It's a two-way street because, right, if I'm in a relationship with somebody, I want to try to meet their expectations. That's not to say that I can all of the time or I should, because again, especially in close relationships, there should be a space for this compromising and negotiating about what the expectations are so that we are coming to an agreement where, we both say, yes, I can meet that expectation most of the time.
Yeah.
But so often the expectations just go unsaid. It's just something that's in my head. And then I'm kind of in this like thinking you should just know, you should read my mind and know what I expect. Because to me, it seems completely logical and makes perfect sense. Of course, that's what the expectation is.
You've known me for 15 years. You should know what I'm thinking.
And it never fails to surprise me, like how different we are as people. Again, yes, even if you've been in a relationship with somebody for a long, long time, that just how different, we are in terms of our expectations and the way that we do things and what we think is important.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, I think it feels like you have to over communicate. And that might be a helpful way to think about it because we really go through life, I think, assuming that people understand a lot about who we are and what we need and what's going on with us without actually putting it into words. And if we can, really sort of, you have to tap into it for yourself before you can communicate it to somebody else. You have to know what it is. And again, that's something that's not necessarily easy because it's just obvious, to me that that's what should be done.
Yeah.
I have to really recognize that consciously in order to then communicate it to somebody else. And recognize that might not be obvious to them. And that's not because there's anything wrong with them. It's just we're different people.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Sharon, I just want to thank you once again for being so willing to come on the podcast and talk to us about boundaries, but just sharing your experience too. It's so helpful to have, I think, personal, relatable stories that help others recognize, that they're not alone, that this is a hard place to be and takes some practice. And I'm hopeful that your new book will give people even more direction and help in this area. But when is the new book available and how are people going to find it and you?
Yes, you can order a copy now.
Nice.
So that's very exciting. And folks can find me at my website, which is livewellwithsharonmartin.com. And there they can, kind of find all the different things that I've got going on.
Yeah.
Info on the book. And I've got a free quick quiz that people can take about boundaries too, to help them figure out, sort of what area they need to work on, what sort of element of boundaries is needing their attention.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I will provide links in the show notes so that people can either pre-order it or order it, and links to your website too.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Awaken Your Wise Woman podcast. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Music by Andy Cush, sound editing by Laura Disler, and show notes by Kathy Cush. If you'd like more information about me, Biz Cush, and the resources shared today, go to awakenyourwisewoman.com.